By the time anybody noticed the wagon had broken loose, the little girl was already in its path. Tom Mercer heard the iron scream before he saw the team. A freight wagon had jumped its chock above the spring house and was coming down the Comanche slope with two panicked bays throwing foam from their bits, the brake chain snapping against the wheel like a rifle being cocked and cocked again. Men shouted from the loading shed. Somebody yelled for Ruthie Bell to move. The child only stood there in the white dust, one shoe half off, clutching a rag doll by the neck as if stillness might make the whole roaring thing miss her. Tom did not shout. He was moving before the second cry left anyone's mouth. He came off the porch rail in one long drop, hit the yard hard enough to jar his teeth, and ran for the dun gelding tied at the trough. By the time his hand found mane, he was already barefoot in one stirrup. The horse knew him. That was part of Tom's gift. He never had to explain himself to a horse. The dun turned on a heel and lunged uphill under him, and Tom rode straight into the path of the bolting team with the sun full in his eyes and the taste of old dust and iron sitting bitter on the back of his tongue. There was one thin second when the world drew tight as wire. Then Tom leaned low, flung his rope, caught the lead bay high across the chest, and yanked his dun sideways toward the spring fence. The wagon fishtailed. One will climb the trough stones. The whole bed tilted so far men cried out thinking it would roll, but the turn took the force out of it. One horse went down to its knees. The other twisted. The wagon slammed broadside into the cedar post fence hard enough to burst a barrel and send a sheet of water and flour-white dust over the yard. When it was done, the team was shuddering. The brake beam split. The doll was lying face first in the mud, and Ruthie Bell was in Tom's arms with her little heart pounding against him like a trapped quail. He set her down carefully. For a breath, nobody spoke. Water ran over broken boards. One of the bays blew blood from a cut lip. Tom's own shoulder burned where the wagon tongue had clipped him, but he kept his hand on the child until her mother came stumbling out of the mercantile yard and snatched her close. Ruthie hid her face in her mother's skirt, then twisted back long enough to look at Tom with the stunned solemnity children have after they are snatched back from harm. "You got there quick," she said. Tom gave one small nod. That was when Silas Bell arrived, hatless, coat unbuttoned, his store keys still hanging from his belt. He looked first at the wagon, then at his daughter, then at the rope in Tom's hand. Relief crossed his face so briefly it might have been imagined. After that came the harder thing he wore more naturally: possession, authority, the smooth-set expression of a man used to deciding what a moment means before anybody else can. "You all right, Ruthie?" The girl nodded against her mother. Silas rested a hand on her hair, then turned to Tom. "Good work with the team." It was the sort of sentence men heard as gratitude until they listened closely and found nothing warm in it. Good work with the team. Not with my daughter. Not with saving her life. Tom knew the difference. So did the people standing around with wet boots and their mouths half open. Still, Silas Bell had spoken, and that was enough for some. Old Mr. Vale from the feed shed cleared his throat and muttered that the boy could handle a horse. There was no denying it. Jonah Pike the blacksmith spat into the mud and said there'd have been a funeral if Tom hadn't cut across that slope the way he did. Mrs. Bell clutched Ruthie tighter and did not look up at all. Tom swung down, loosened his rope from the lead bay, and checked the animal's leg. His fingers moved gently over tendon and bone, sure as clean water. The horse stilled under his touch. He could feel the eyes on the back of his neck then, the familiar kind. Some grateful, some wary, some counting the same old count they had been taking on him since he was small enough to fit inside Ada Mercer's wash tub the day she brought him home from the flats above Dry Creek. If you're listening tonight with your hands busy and the day finally behind you, tell me where you're hearing this from. A kitchen in Alberta, a porch in Georgia, a small house in Norfolk, a sheep station road in New South Wales. I've always liked knowing where a story lands when it leaves one patch of earth and goes looking for another. Tom handed the bay off to the freighter and started for home, without waiting to be thanked by people who had spent 10 years deciding what to call him when he was not in earshot. Some used his name. Some used Mercer Boy. Some used less kind things and voices they thought the wind would carry away before he heard them. The Mercer place sat a quarter-mile below town where the spring widened into a clear run lined with cottonwoods and switchgrass. Water had always been the rarest kind of power in that country. Men would forgive almost anything except a person standing too close to the thing keeping them alive. Ada Mercer had known that for years, and still she had refused every offer made on that strip of land. When Tom crossed the yard, she was on the porch pinning a dark dress hem, spectacles low on her nose. One foot working the treadle of the sewing machine, she kept near the door for better light. She looked up once, took in the mud to his knees and the fresh tear in his shirt, then looked back down to snip the thread. Ruthie Bell, breathing. That'll do. She set the dress aside. Your shoulder? It'll move. Ada rose, narrow and upright as a fence post weathered silver, her hair pinned into the same severe knot it had worn for as long as Tom could remember. She was not a woman the town mistook for soft, but there are kinds of tenderness that do not announce themselves. Hers lived in soup kept warm without asking if a man was hungry and shirts mended before he admitted they were torn, and the way she always stood with one hip between Tom and a room that might turn against him. She touched the place where the wagon tongue had hit him. Her fingers were cool and smelled faintly of starch and sage. Tom flinched before he could stop it. Ada's hand paused there one extra second. She had noticed every flinch he ever made at iron, loud voices, or gunmetal catching sun. She never said much about it. She only noticed. Come wash, she said. He pumped water into the basin and stripped to the waist behind the porch screen while she laid out clean bandage cloth. The shoulder was blooming purple already. As she wrapped it, he stared through the screen toward the spring run, where dragonflies hovered above the reeds like bits of blue glass. The yard smelled of wet dirt and horse sweat and the onions Ada had cut for supper. Ordinary smells. Good ones. The kind that tell a person the world has not broken today. You'll have town at the door before sunset, Ada said. Wanting the story? Wanting to say they were always sure of you. She tied the bandage, firm but careful. That kind of certainty usually arrives after the danger has passed. He huffed something close to a laugh. Late light spilled over the pasture. The dun stood under the cottonwoods switching flies, tack still damp. Near the steps lay a narrow strip of beadwork Ada kept in a cedar box and brought out sometimes when the weather turned. She had been mending a shirt and must have set the box open without thinking. Tom saw the blue and black triangles at once. Something in his chest always shifted when he saw that beadwork, though he could not have said why. It was one of the few things found with him all those years ago. Not a full answer. Only proof that before Dry Creek and Ada Mercer and the name Tom, there had been somewhere else. Ada noticed where his eyes had gone and closed the lid. They ate beans and cornbread in the cooling air while nighthawks dipped over the water. After supper, Jonah Pike came by with word from town. A rail spur surveyor was expected within the week. Silas Bell had been courting freight business for months, talking up a stock loading point, a larger storehouse, more families, more trade. He wanted a holding pond cut below the Mercer Spring to water cattle through the dry weeks. Said it was the future of Dry Creek. Said nobody had a right to keep that much water private while the town grew thirsty. Ada told him no. Jonah said, tipping back in his chair, thumbs hooked in his suspenders. He likes hearing no about as much as a mule likes hornets. Ada kept shelling peas. Silas likes hearing his own plans repeated by other people until they sound like law. Jonah grimaced toward Tom. He was none too pleased folks saw who stopped that wagon today. Tom said nothing. Jonah's eyes softened. Not everybody's blind, boy. Tom was too old to be called boy by most men, but from Jonah it came out like weathered affection rather than diminishment. The blacksmith had once told Tom that a horse's mouth and a man's eyes both gave away the truth if a person knew where to look. Jonah looked well. After he left, Ada sat longer than usual with her hands folded in her lap. Crickets started up along the bank. Somewhere a coyote called out beyond the mesquite. Tom was rinsing dishes in the basin when he heard wheels on the road. Not a freight wagon. Lighter. Army patterned by the sound of the iron. A government wagon pulled into the yard at dusk carrying a white-bearded driver, 2 sacks of cornmeal, and an old Indian woman wrapped in a blue blanket despite the heat. She sat straight-backed on the bench as if distance had hardened her into wood. One eye was clouded. The other moved over the house, the spring, the yard, and then fixed on Tom where he stood with suds up to his wrists. He had seen Indian people before in town only rarely, usually traveling through under watch or trading quick and leaving quicker. Something old and deep inside him rose so suddenly it left him cold. The driver lifted a hand. Evening, Mrs. Mercer. Agent at Fort Sill asked me to leave these on the route. Woman needed water more than Kansas needed punctuality. Ada invited them up without fuss. The old woman drank slowly from the dipper, then looked again at Tom. Not at his face first, at the bead strip protruding from the half-shut cedar box beside Ada's chair. Her good eye widened. The dipper lowered. She said one word in a language Tom did not know with his thinking mind, but knew somewhere older than thought. It struck him like a hand on the sternum. Tabe. The basin slipped from his fingers and hit the porch boards with a crack. No one moved. Even the driver seemed to understand he had crossed into another family's weather. The old woman spoke again, softer this time. Tabe. Then she touched her own chest and said a name, and another, and pointed toward the west where the caprock burned red in the last light. Her voice shook. She reached into her blanket and brought out a small leather pouch, worn pale at the corners. Sewn into it was the same blue and black bead pattern as the strip in Ada's box. Tom could not breathe right. Ada had gone very still. The old woman looked from the pouch to Tom, and then to Ada, and in the quiet that followed, the 10 years between his first memory and this one seemed to gather themselves into something sharp enough to cut. Ada, Tom said, though it came out rough and small. Why does she know that? Ada took off her spectacles and folded them in both hands. In the yard the mule stamped once against the traces. The evening smelled of creek water and peas and distant lightning. Everything ordinary remained, and still the world had changed. She knows it, Ada said, because that was the name your mother called you before you came here. Tom stared at her. She did not look away. The old woman shut her fingers around the pouch and began to cry without sound. Tom heard himself ask the next question before he had decided to. Who killed them? Ada's face did not crumple. That would have been easier to witness. It only emptied, like a lamp turned low. The men from Dry Creek, she said, and my husband rode with them. Tom stood in the broken wash water, shoulder throbbing, while the first true shape of his life rose up through the floorboards to meet him. He slept in the barn that night because the house felt too small to hold what had been said. Or he lay in the hay and waited for morning, which is not the same thing. Sleep kept stopping at the edge of him and turning back. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw the old woman's one clear eye and the leather pouch in her hand, blue and black beads bright as creek shadow. Tabe. The name moved through him like water under earth, unseen and impossible to ignore once you knew it was there. Outside, the horses shifted now and then. A hoof struck the plank wall. Dry hay scratched the back of his neck. The shoulder he had banged on the wagon ached hotter in the night. Somewhere down by the run, frogs sang in the reeds. It was the same music he had heard since childhood, and yet he lay listening to it as a stranger in a borrowed life. At dawn he saddled the dun and rode west along the creek until the grass thinned and the flats opened under a pale sky. He did not tell Ada where he was going. He did not need to. She had always known when he needed distance more than food. The place lay above the bend where the creek ran shallow over gravel. Tom had crossed it 100 times after cattle, after strays, after nothing at all. He had never known why he hated the feel of that ground. Now he did. The soil there carried old iron. Not much. Just enough that the horses pricked their ears and stepped light if he let them choose their footing. He dismounted and walked. There was no grave marker anyone would call a grave marker. Just a scatter of stones that did not belong naturally together and one half-buried brass button green with age. The wind moved through the shin oak with a sound like a woman breathing through pain. Tom crouched and pressed his palm against the dirt. It was warm already. Sun had gotten there before truth. He saw nothing with his eyes. Not faces. Not gun smoke. Only fragments his body seemed to remember for him. The sour bite of fierce sweat on horsehide, a woman's arm hard around his ribs, the thunder of animals driven too fast, the crack of rifles, and the abrupt blank after. He might have stayed there till noon if Ada had not come looking. He heard her mule before he saw her. She reined in a few yards back and sat without speaking. The sun had found the silver in her hair. She carried no defense except the plain fact of herself. Tom did not rise. You should have told me sooner, he said. Yes. You let me call him father. I never told you to. Her voice was tired, not sharp. You were 5 and grieving and too young to understand what had happened. By the time you were old enough to ask better questions, I had grown cowardly. Tom dug his fingers into the dirt. Did he shoot my mother? Ada took a long breath. No, but he rode with the others because he was afraid of being the only man left behind. He came home with blood on his sleeve and would not say whose. Tom shut his eyes. He was not a cruel man in the ways people mean when they say cruel, Ada went on. He was worse. He was weak at the exact moment strength was required. A weak man in a frightened crowd can kill as surely as a monster can. That hurt because it sounded true. He looked back at the stone scatter. Why keep me? Ada's answer came without hurry. Because your mother was still alive when I found you. Barely. She had crawled to the wagon track, dragging you under her with a bullet in her side. She put that bead strip in my hand. She kept saying your name. Ada swallowed once. And because when the men saw you, Silas Bell said to leave you there. I said no. The wind shifted. Creek smell came up cool from the bend. Tom had never asked about the first day. Part of him had known there was a reason. Did you save me because you felt sorry, he asked, or because you felt guilty? Ada looked out over the flats for a long time before answering. At first those may have been the same thing. He almost said something harsh then. It rose like bile and stopped at his teeth. Ada sat under the clean, hard morning with both hands on the mule reins and took the weight of his silence without trying to dodge it. Finally she said, the old woman's name is Sanaa. Your mother's aunt, I think. She's headed back toward Fort Sill with a driver carrying rations. She says there may be kin there still. If you want to go, I will not stand in your way. That should have made the choice easy. A true name. Possible blood. A chance to step out of a life built by the same town that had torn the first one away from him. But below them the creek ran bright through Ada's cottonwoods, and from where he stood he could see the roof of her house catching sun. He could see the corral he had mended, the barn he had slept in, the patch of onions, the porch chair with one leg repaired twice. Love leaves its evidence lying around in humble objects. That was the trouble. When they rode back, Dry Creek was already restless. Survey stakes had been driven along the road overnight. Men gathered outside Bell Mercantile, talking loud enough to be mistaken for certainty. By noon, the whole town knew the government wagon had brought an old Indian woman to Ada Mercer's place. And by supper time, everyone knew the Mercer boy had another name, and that another name mattered. Silas Bell sent for Ada before evening. They found him in the back office of the store with ledgers stacked at his elbow and a county map pinned to the wall. He had recovered his usual composure, the one that made other men unconsciously lower their voices. He invited Ada to sit and did not offer the same courtesy to Tom. I'll speak plain, Silas said. The surveyor reaches us by Friday. If the rail spur comes through, this town lives. If it doesn't, Dry Creek stays a watering stop with illusions. We need a holding pond cut below your spring. I'm prepared to compensate you fairly. Ada folded her hands over her reticule. You mean cheaply. Silas smiled the way one does at a child who has misnamed a lesson. I mean in proportion to what the land is worth without town access. It has town access, Tom said. Folks draw from it every week. Silas turned his head slowly toward him. This conversation is between property owners. Tom felt Ada stiffen beside him. He said nothing more. Silas lifted a paper. There's also the matter of your outstanding store credit, Mrs. Mercer. Seed, lamp oil, cloth, coffee. A widow's ledger can grow teeth if neglected. Ada's eyes never left his. You've been waiting to say that for months. I've been waiting for you to behave sensibly. He tapped the county map, where a penciled line cut straight through the Mercer lower field. Sell now and keep your dignity. Refuse, and the town petition goes to the county judge. Public necessity carries force. Tom saw then what made men like Silas dangerous. Not temper, not volume. A soft voice can move just as much damage if the room is built to lean toward it. Outside the office, townspeople milled in the heat, pretending not to listen. Mrs. Vale, the schoolteacher, stood by the cracker barrels with her chin set. Jonah Pike leaned one shoulder to the doorframe, arms folded. Ruthie Bell peered around a spool table until her mother caught her hand and drew her back. Ada rose. I buried a husband on that land. I planted what little I had left there. I took in a child there when half this town would have let him die. You are not getting the spring by intimidation, Silas. His gaze shifted to Tom again, and something colder showed through. I imagine that child is exactly why this may become unpleasant. There are men in this county who do not care to have an Indian claim the best water near their stock. Tom kept his face still. Silas went on. Especially not one whose family history is now making the rounds. Jonah Pike stepped fully into the doorway then. That enough, Silas. Silas spread his hands as if all he had done was name the weather. They left without another word. That night, Sanaa sat with Tom by the spring while Ada banked the fire indoors. The old woman's English came hard but true in pieces, as though each word had to be lifted over a ridge before it could reach him. She told him his mother's people had been pushed north after the war, that hunger had done what soldiers had started, that many children had been lost to fever, boarding places, distance, forgetting. She told him his father had traded horses and could turn a restless mount with his knees alone. That much made Ada's porch stories rearrange themselves in Tom's mind. So that was where it had come from. Not a miracle. A lineage. Sanaa held out the leather pouch. Inside was a lock of black hair tied with red thread and a small silver conchus hammered with a hawk. "Your father," she said. Tom's throat worked uselessly. "I thought I was empty," he said at last. Sanaa looked at the water moving past reeds and moonlit stones. Empty is only what a bucket feels before the spring finds it. He turned the silver piece in his palm. It was warm from her hand. Later, while Ada was darning by lamplight, Tom set the pouch on the table between them. "I can go north with her," he said. "Yes. And if I do, Belle gets the spring." Ada kept sewing. "Likely. If I stay, I help the people who killed my family." "Yes. Which would you have me do?" The needle paused. She laid the stocking aside and met his eyes. "I'd have you do the thing that lets you live with yourself after the dust settles. Not the thing that punishes me. I've earned punishment enough." He looked at the pouch again, then at her hands, roughened by work no one thanked her for. He had spent years believing his life began with her saying no on the worst day of his life. Now he understood that love can begin inside guilt and still become love by staying. The porch boards popped as the night cooled. At last Ada said, almost to herself, "A name can be buried for a while, but it keeps breathing under the dirt." Tom did not answer because the line had gone clean through him. By Thursday, the town had split into the usual kinds of camps. There were those who sided with Silas because his version of the future promised money. There were those who sided with Ada because they preferred decency or at least hated being bullied. And there were those who moved whichever way the loudest voice pushed them that day. Tom spent the morning riding fence below the spring, measuring ground with his eyes the way some men measure with stakes. He knew every fold of that land, where clay gave way to gravel, where hard rain would sheet, and where it would bite. Silas's proposed holding pond sat wrong. The bank below, it would not carry a rush. It would scour out and take the lower road with it. He tried telling the surveyor when the man arrived, but the fellow only smiled thinly and said local arrangements were not his concern. He was paid to draw lines, not argue with merchants. By evening, a work crew hired by Bell was already cutting at the lower bank. Tom rode up and told them to stop. One laughed. One looked uneasy. One said he was only earning supper. Silas appeared from behind the wagon, coat off, sleeves rolled. "You've had your say. That cut won't hold," Tom said. "First hard rain, and it'll peel open to bedrock." Silas took a shovel from a laborer and drove it into the bank himself, smooth and contemptuous. "Then let's hope for fair weather." Tom watched the clay crumble differently where the blade bit. It told the truth even when men wouldn't. Some of you already know the shape of this kind of choice. When the people who have done you harm are also tied up with the innocent who'll suffer beside them, what do you do then? Do you let the whole thing break and call it justice? Or do you lay your own hands on the damage again because somebody has to? Hold that question with you a little longer. The answer is where this story earns its ending. The answer came sooner than anyone wanted. Just after midnight, the wind shifted from the north and brought the smell Tom had been dreading all day. Raw rain on hot stone, heavy and metallic, the kind that gathers far off on the caprock and arrives all at once down every wash and cut. He was awake before the first drops struck the roof. By the third, he was pulling on his boots. Ada was already at the door. "You smell it too." He nodded. "If that ditch is open, the bank goes." Lightning flashed without thunder yet, the clouds still marching in from a distance. Tom saddled the dun by touch while rain began as a scatter and turned inside a minute to hard silver cords. The horse danced once, then steadied under his voice. Tom rode for the lower field. The crew's shovels and braces lay where they had been dropped at dusk. Worse than that, the temporary sluice Bell had ordered cut from the spring run toward the new basin had been left half opened, maybe to fill the holding pit by morning and prove the scheme worked before Ada could bring papers to the county judge. Water already hissed through it in the rain. Tom slid from the saddle in mud and scrambled down the bank. He jammed boards across the opening and stamped clay around them. The water pressed harder. Rain battered his back. Above him on the ridge, lanterns moved. Bell's men, coming too late to prevent trouble and just in time to witness it. "Need more hands," Tom shouted. The wind took half of it away. He saw Silas then, hat brim dripping, lantern up. "Leave it," the man yelled back. "If the basin fills, we can bleed it slow." Tom knew that was a lie or ignorance, and either one could kill just as well. He hauled another brace into place. The creek below, usually clear and talkative, was already thickening with runoff. Thunder came, then the real rain. It hit as if a sluice had opened over the whole night. Within moments, the cut banks were rivers. Mud sucked at Tom's boots. The temporary sluice shuddered under the weight pushing behind it. One board snapped free and struck his thigh. "Rope," he shouted. Jonah Pike appeared at his shoulder like something hammered out of storm itself, beard streaming water. "Got one." Together they looped the brace and hauled while two more men slid in behind them. Not Bell's crew. Town men. Men who had come because when a spring breaks, private grudges stop mattering for a little while. For a second it seemed the makeshift gate might hold. Then a sound rose upstream that turned every head at once. Not thunder. Worse. A wall of runoff came down the draw from the west, carrying brush, a calf carcass, and half a cedar rail fence in its frothing front. It hit the cut bank above the basin with enough force to split the clay seam Tom had warned them about. The whole slope slumped in a black wave. "Back!" Jonah roared. Tom jumped clear as the bank tore open. The new basin vanished. Water found the unfinished channel and took it greedily, widening it with each heartbeat. Below, the lower road disappeared. Lights were moving in town now. Bells clanged. Dogs barked madly. A woman screamed for her children. Silas still stood on the ridge for one astonished moment, like a man discovering that the earth had not consulted him. Then the ground under his boots gave way, and he went down with the sliding bank, lanterns spinning off into the dark. Tom saw him vanish. There was no time to think. The water-taking Bell would take the road next, then the schoolhouse sitting on the low side of the main street. Mrs. Vale often kept 3 or 4 children overnight when storms threatened on outlying ranches, Ruthie Bell among them tonight. Tom knew because he had seen her carry a slate there after supper. He was on the dun again before the thought finished forming. "Schoolhouse," he yelled to Jonah. "Get folks to the church rise." Rain lashed sideways. The gelding climbed the street like he hated standing still. Water ran ankle deep already between the false front stores. Men were dragging crates from the mercantile. Women hurried children uphill wrapped in quilts. The church bell rang not for worship now, but warning. Tom cut left through the alley and nearly ran over Mrs. Bell, stumbling in the dark. "Ruthie," she cried. "She's with Mrs. Vale." He was gone before she finished. The schoolhouse door stuck from swelling. Tom hit it once with his shoulder, once more, then kicked beside the latch and burst it inward. Inside, lamplight shook over terrified faces. Mrs. Vale, 3 children, Ruthie curled under a desk with her doll, and a boy from Pike's place crying through his nosebleed. Water was already seeping under the floorboards from the backside where the gully ran. "Now," Tom said. "No bundles." Mrs. Vale looked at his face and did not waste a second. "Children up." He took the 2 smallest, one under each arm, and shoved them toward the horse tied by the hitch rail. Mrs. Vale had the others by the wrists when the back window shattered inward under a branch and a sheet of muddy water slammed across the room, snuffing the lamp. Dark. Screaming. Splintering wood. Tom found Ruthie by sound. He dragged her up just as a desk spun into his shins. Mrs. Vale had the Pike boy. The schoolhouse gave a deep groan. One sentence of stillness passed through Tom's mind as clear as if someone else had spoken it there. "If the wall goes, the roof comes with it." He shoved the children out into rain. The dun flattened his ears and held steady while Tom swung Ruthie up behind the saddle and passed the others to Mrs. Vale. "Ride to the church rise," he said. "Don't stop." "What about you?" He looked toward the mercantile where a lantern was waving from an upper window. "Bell's people. Trapped." "Go." Mrs. Vale did. Tom ran. Mud took his boots to the ankle. The mercantile porch had already lost one support post and sagged toward the street. Inside, voices cried from above. Tom climbed through the back rather than the front because the front would fail first. He knew buildings the way he knew horses, by stress and sound. Upstairs, he found Mrs. Bell with Ruthie's baby brother and the clerk pinned by a fallen wardrobe. They were all breathing panic into a room that smelled of wet plaster and kerosene. "Where's Bell?" Tom shouted. Mrs. Bell looked at him with wild white around the eyes. "He went to the spring." Tom nodded once. "Good. One problem decided by another." He heaved the wardrobe just enough for the clerk to crawl free, then got the woman and child down the rear stairs. The whole way the house shook with water striking it broadside from the channel that had never existed before tonight. When they reached the alley, Tom turned to go back for a ledger chest Mrs. Bell was trying to drag. "Leave it," he said. "My husband's books." "Leave them." Something in his voice made her obey. They had taken 10 steps uphill when the mercantile porch folded with a cracking sigh and vanished into the black water. Tom turned at the sound and saw, for the brief white blade of a lightning flash, a horse pinned against the mill race fence below the broken bank. On the horse was Silas Bell, half in the saddle, one leg trapped under the frightened animal, water battering both of them toward the culvert. Tom ran downhill. Later, some in Dry Creek would say there was never any question that he would. Others would remember the exact pause in his stride when he saw who it was and wonder if the whole town had balanced there a moment on the thin edge between one kind of future and another. Silas saw him coming, and for the first time in all the years Tom had known his face, the man looked plain frightened. "Help me," he shouted. The horse screamed and rolled an eye bright as glass. On Silas's saddle, catching each flash of lightning, was a silver conchus hammered with a hawk. Tom stopped dead. The pouch in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. His father's. Not rumor now. Not guilt by association. Proof. The man drowning in front of him had taken something off the body of the man he had helped kill and worn it for 10 years as if the dead owed him decoration. Water slammed Tom to one knee. He grabbed the fence and looked at Silas Bell, at the silver hawk, at the torrent clawing for both of them. He threw the rope anyway. "Loop it under the horse's neck," he shouted. Silas fumbled once, twice, got it through. Tom wrapped the other end around a cedar post and hauled until his shoulders screamed. Jonah Pike and 2 ranch hands hit the line beside him a breath later. Together they rolled the horse enough for Silas to wrench his leg free. The animal went downstream without them. They dragged Bell to the bank just as the culvert gave way with a roar that shook the street. Tom rolled onto his back in the rain, chest heaving. Across from him, Silas coughed creek water and clutched mud with both hands like a man trying to keep hold of the whole world by force. Then Jonah yelled from uphill. "Ada!" Tom was on his feet before the name finished. The springhouse lantern had gone dark. Ada had gone there after him. He knew it as surely as he knew a trail sign in dust. Because if she had thought him at the water, she would have come. That was who she was. That was the trouble with loving people like Ada Mercer. They made choices as if fear had no vote. He ran back through rain that stung like grit. At the spring house, the door hung crooked, one hinge torn. Water boiled around the foundation. Inside, one beam had fallen across the pump table. Beneath it, Ada lay twisted against the wall, awake but pinned by the lower leg. "Don't start with that face," she said through clenched teeth when she saw him. "I'm not dead yet." Even then he nearly laughed. He shoved shoulder and back under the beam and lifted. Pain tore through the bruise from the wagon. For an instant the wood did not move. Then Jonah was beside him, then another pair of hands, and together they raised it enough for Ada to pull free. The floor lurched. The rear wall began to bow inward. Outside, the road from town to the spring was a river. Tom got Ada onto the dun in front of him. She was breathing fast but held herself rigid, one hand white-knuckled on the saddle horn. As he turned uphill, she touched his wrist. "Silas. Alive." She closed her eyes once, not in disappointment and not in relief either. Just in recognition of the kind of man Tom had chosen to be when no one could have blamed him for choosing otherwise. By dawn the rain had passed east and left Dry Creek looking flayed open. The lower road was gone. The mercantile porch had collapsed entirely. The schoolhouse wall needed rebuilding. One barn had floated 20 yards and lodged against the church fence. But the town itself was standing. Children were alive. The spring, though scarred, still ran. Men walked through the wreckage with that hollowed look people wear after disaster when they begin counting what remains instead of what was taken. Ada's leg was bruised badly, but not broken. Mrs. Bell brought broth. Mrs. Vale brought clean linens. Jonah repaired the spring house door without being asked. None of them spoke much. Storms do that to people. They blow the useless words away first. On the second evening, when the sky turned clear enough for swallows again, Tom sat on the porch steps unwrapping the leather pouch. Ada watched from the rocker with her injured leg propped on a crate. The silver hawk conchus lay between them on the step. He had taken it from Silas's saddle while the man still coughed mud. Bell had been too broken in pride and body to stop him. You remember it, Ada said quietly. Not with my head. He touched the hammered edges. My hands know it. She nodded. After a while she rose, went inside, and came back carrying a folded paper worn soft at the creases. Eli wrote this 2 winters before he died, she said. I never burned it. I thought sometimes I should. I think now that was vanity. I did not want the evidence of my grief to disappear. Tom took the paper. It says he fired into the grass after the others did, Ada said. Says he heard a child crying and could not make himself search the bodies for fear he'd find what he'd helped do. Says Silas took a silver piece from a dead man's saddle and called it payment for years of raiding, though he knew nothing about the people he'd shot. Says he was ashamed every day after. She looked out toward the spring. It is not enough, but it is true. Tom read slowly. Eli Mercer's hand wavered in places as if guilt had trembled even his pen. No absolution lived on the page. Only confession. He folded it back up. You could use this to ruin him, Ada said. Tom glanced toward town, where Bell Mercantile stood shorn and leaning. Maybe. You'd be justified. Maybe. And will you? He sat so long she thought perhaps he would not answer. Then he said, I want what's mine, not what his ruin happens to leave lying around. Ada's eyes shone, though she smiled only a little. Across the yard, Jonah Pike, who had come with a new brace for the fence and had heard more than he meant to, lowered his gaze and went back to his hammering without a word. That night, after the lamp was turned down and the frogs started in the reeds again, Tom found Ada awake in the rocker, the paper letter still on her lap. He brought a blanket and laid it over her knees though the air was warm. You should sleep inside, he said. In a minute. He stood by the rail. The spring glimmered pale beyond the cottonwoods. The house smelled of lamp oil, willow bark tea, and rain-damp wood. Home smells. Complicated ones. Ada. She waited. If I leave for Fort Sill one day, it won't be to leave you. Her mouth tightened the way it did when strong feeling arrived in a person long practiced at carrying it alone. I know, she said. He sat on the top step. For a little while neither of them looked at the other. Some truths are easier side by side than face to face. At last Ada said, Your mother gave you to Mercy because there was nothing else left in reach. Tom looked down at his hands. She did not choose the men, Ada said. She chose the only woman among them who looked ashamed enough to carry you properly. He let out a breath that shook more than he liked. I've hated pieces of my own life this week, he admitted. Hated this porch for being the first porch I remember. Hated the creek for sounding kind when it kept flowing after. His voice dropped. Hated you some too. You should have. But when that water took you, all I wanted was for it not to. He swallowed. I don't know what to do with both things being true. Ada turned then and looked at him fully. The moon had silvered the fine lines around her eyes. She reached down, not quickly, and set her hand over his. Blood tells you where pain began. Mercy tells you where it ends. He bowed his head. If that line found something tender in you just now, stay with it a second. Those are the moments this kind of story is built for. If you want more stories that leave room for hurt and still make a home for hope, this is the place to like the video and subscribe while the feeling is still warm in your hands. Tom did not realize he was crying until Ada's thumb moved once against his knuckles, and he felt the wet coolness of the night on his face. 3 days later, the county judge came out from Weatherford to inspect the damage, hear complaints, and settle whose land and money the flood had made newly troublesome. Dry Creek gathered in the church because it was the only building large enough to hold both people and grievance. Silas Bell arrived on a cane, pale under his tan, with one trouser leg cut open at the shin where the doctor had stitched him. He still wore authority like a coat, but it hung worse now. Men who nearly drown and must be hauled out by those they scorn do not fit themselves quite the same afterward. The judge heard first about the road, then the schoolhouse, then the mercantile loss. Finally, he came to the question of the spring and the failed holding basin. Silas spoke beautifully. He always had. He said he had acted for Dry Creek's future. He said weather of unusual force, not poor judgment, had caused the washout. He said Mrs. Mercer had long stood in the way of improvements needed by the whole community. He said a great many things in a voice made to carry reason into rooms already inclined to mistake confidence for it. Then the judge asked if anyone could testify to conditions on the lower bank before the storm. Tom stood. A murmur went through the church. Some because he rarely spoke in gatherings. Some because they knew exactly who he was now and found the knowledge newly inconvenient. Tom told the judge where the clay seams sat under the topsoil, how the cut had undermined the bank, how the sluice had been left half open overnight, and how runoff from the caprock naturally struck that bend first in heavy north rain. He spoke plainly and without flourish. The judge asked how he knew. Because I've ridden that ground in every season since I was small, Tom said. Because the land says what it can bear if you pay attention. Jonah Pike stood next and confirmed the warning Tom had given before the storm. So did two of Bell's hired men, one shamed by loss, the other by conscience. Mrs. Bell testified that Tom had saved the children from the schoolhouse. Mrs. Bell, quiet and stiff, testified that he had come back for her and her son after that, when he could have left them. Each voice shifted the room a little. Then Ada rose. She walked with care, but no hesitation to the front pew rail. In her hands, she held Eli Mercer's letter and the Silver Hawk Conchus. This concerns not only the spring, she said, but the man who presumed to claim it in the town's name. Silas's face changed then, only a fraction, but enough. Ada told the judge about the night 10 years earlier when frightened settlers had ridden out against a small Comanche family at the Creek Flats. She did not spare her husband. She did not spare herself. She read the relevant lines of Eli's confession aloud in a voice so level it made the room listen harder. Then she held up the silver piece and said Silas Bell had taken it from one of the dead and kept it. No one in the church moved. Silas shifted his cane. A dead raider's tack, he said. Nothing more. Sanaa, who had delayed her departure long enough to see the matter through, stood from the back pew wrapped in her blue blanket. She came slowly down the aisle, took the conchus from Ada's hand, and named the pattern and the family line it belonged to in halting English. Then, for those who needed plainer speech, she said, not war gear. Wedding gift. From wife's people to husband. The silence that followed felt different from the one after the wagon rescue. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Silas looked around the room and found fewer allies in the faces turned toward him than he had expected. That was the beginning of his true undoing. Not chains. Not blood. Just the slow collapse of certainty in other people's eyes. The judge took statements, examined the survey marks, and by midday ruled the attempted diversion negligent and the petition for public seizure of the Mercer Spring void. He also ordered Bell to bear costs for road repair out of mercantile credit previously claimed against Ada's account, pending review of his books. At that, Mrs. Bell lowered her head. She had known before many others, it seemed, that the ledgers could not survive honest daylight. 2 weeks later, a state inspector passing with the railmen found Bell's store accounts artfully inconsistent in ways that mostly benefited Bell. Not enough for prison, perhaps, and this was not the sort of story built for spectacular ruin, but enough that his standing cracked. Men took business to Weatherford. Ranchers stopped extending trust on a handshake. The surveyor placed the rail spur 3 miles south where ground was firmer and water less disputed. Dry Creek lived without Bell being its future. That was another kind of verdict. He did not apologize. Some men are too poor in soul for that payment. But one evening near harvest, while Tom was resetting a corner post, Silas came on the lane with his cane and stood watching until Tom acknowledged him. I'd have drowned, Silas said. Yes. Silas looked toward the spring. That town will make a saint of you if you let it. Tom set the post rammer down. No danger of that. A shadow of the old smoothness crossed Bell's face, then failed to settle. I was a young man when your people came to the flats. Young men can be fools in groups. Tom waited. Silas's gaze dropped to the mud on his own boot. I told myself for years that fear excused it. Then that time would. Turns out neither does much. It was not repentance. Not fully. But it was the first honest sentence Tom had ever heard from him. What do you want from me? Tom asked. Silas took longer to answer than pride would have once allowed. Nothing I have a right to ask. He turned and went back toward town, walking a little more carefully than before, like a man newly aware the ground might not hold wherever he insists upon stepping. That was how his power ended in Dry Creek. Not with a shot. With the town learning it could imagine itself without him and then doing exactly that. The weeks that followed laid a different shape over everything. Men from 3 ranches and the church rebuilt the schoolhouse higher on the rise. Ada, who had spent years being tolerated more than valued, found women knocking at her door for advice about gardens, fevers, and accounts. Mrs. Bell sent Ruthie with peach preserves and no message attached, which was message enough. Jonah Pike fashioned a new latch for the spring house and carved a hawk into the wood without comment. Tom went north with Sanaa for 6 days as far as the agency road near Fort Sill, long enough to meet an uncle who had his mother's eyes and none of her gentleness. They sat by a cook fire and spoke through 3 languages and several silences. The uncle placed a hand on Tom's shoulder and told him the dead had kept his name for him all this time. Tom told him there was a woman in Texas who had done the same. When he rode back south, he carried no confusion about whether he belonged more to one kindness than another. Belonging, he was starting to learn, could be wider than injury. He came home to find Ada on the porch shelling butter beans, spectacles low, pretending she had not looked up the road every hour since noon. He dismounted and said, "You left the gate hanging." She sniffed. "Then fix it, Tabe." It was the first time she had used the name without fear in it. Autumn browned the grass. The spring ran clear through the scarred bank and into a stone-lined trough the town helped build at the road so travelers and local families alike could water there without trespass. That had been Tom's suggestion and Ada's condition. What was theirs would remain theirs. What the town needed could still be shared properly. Justice is sometimes nothing more dramatic than a boundary finally drawn by the right hand. By winter, people in Dry Creek had stopped saying Mercer boy as if it covered uncertainty. Some called him Tom. Some called him Tabe. More and more learned to ask which he preferred and to listen to the answer. He gentled horses for 3 counties, and there were ranchers now who would wait on his judgment about a skittish gelding or a soft patch of ground rather than trust their own. Mrs. Vale invited him to speak to the schoolchildren about reading weather from tracks and birds. Ruthie Bell followed him everywhere when she could escape her sums. Ada pretended to object and never meant it. Years later, when the cottonwoods had thickened along the run and Dry Creek had become the sort of town that no longer feared its own shadow so much, people would still remember the flood as the night the lower road vanished. Tom remembered it differently. To him, it was the night one life finished tearing and another finally took its proper shape. On a spring evening not long after the first bluebonnets came back, he stood by the trough while children splashed their hands in the overflow, and Ada watched from the porch with a shawl around her shoulders though the air was mild. The light turned the water copper, then gold. A breeze carried onion tops, horsehide, and clean mud from the bank. Ruthie, taller now, asked him from the gate whether he meant to answer to both names forever. He looked toward Ada before he replied. She lifted her chin the slightest bit, as if handing him back something she had guarded until it fit him. Home is the place that learns your true name and keeps saying it kindly. Then he went up the porch steps, and Ada opened the screen before he reached for it. And behind them the spring kept talking to the dark under the cottonwoods as the first lamp came on in the kitchen window. And tomorrow night, if you've a mind for another, I'll tell you about the widowed station cook who fed a half-frozen outlaw one winter and discovered by dawn he was the judge's missing brother with a price on his head and a Bible in his coat. Until then, take care of your heart and keep a little room in it for mercy.